hospitable shores of a new world. For many years after the first settlement was made, it was supposed by the colonists that they were on a portion of the American continent, but with the development of the country, the increase of knowledge and the researches of navigators, it was found that they had been discoverers as well as colonizers. They knew all that was known in Europe of the American continent up to the time they were so effectually cut off from the balance of the civilized world, and within the past 50 years 2 other American ships had drifted to their shores. When I told him how many lives had been lost and how much treasure had been squandered by America and other nations in Arctic explorations, and expressed surprise that a people so advanced in the arts of civilization as his nation appeared to be, should make no attempts to establish communication with other parts of the world, but should remain isolated for centuries, he smiled pleasantly and said he could appreciate my feelings. In the first place, he explained that the Iron Republic had never been engaged in maritime commerce to any considerable extent even in the days when trading was encouraged, as there were no other great maritime nations to trade with. As a consequence there was not that passion for voyaging and exploration, which obtains among a maritime people. Nevertheless, some attempts had been made to get through the barriers, and as vessels had sailed away and never returned, it was supposed at the time, that some of them might have succeeded in the attempt. Since the establishment of the Great Republic, though, no efforts had been made in that direction for the reason that there was not sufficient private capital to undertake such enterprises, and from the knowledge they had of the outside world, the government did not desire closer intercourse with the older nations, as it could not possibly do them any good and might result in much harm. This, he admitted, was a species of national selfishness, but selfishness, said he, with a smile, is human and is one thing we have in common with all peoples past and present. He then told me that a Captain Morris had reached their country with a ship and crew during the progress of the Great Civil War, and that some years before that an old American whaler had come to their shores. The whaler remained with them a year and then left with the intention of making his way back to America and was never heard of again. Captain Morris, he informed me, was then in the country and being a man of great ability was at the head of the Government Naval College. The most of his crew, too, were still living and were established in different parts of the country. At the conclusion of an hour of pleasant conversation, the affable director touched a button, saying that it was very probable that the press had given out the details of my arrival. Speaking into a bell-shaped transmitter directly over his table, he called current news and then pushed back his chair in a listening attitude. In a moment, a voice, rich, strong and distinct, answered back through the transmitter. Current news. 8 o'clock to 10. President Wilkes and party arrived this morning at 8:20 by the through express, making the 760 miles from the capital to Corinth thus in 4 hours and 10 minutes. The President comes down to participate in the formal opening of the new temple this evening. Everything is in perfect readiness, and when the lights are turned on tonight the people will have no cause to regret the money expended in its construction. It will seat 5,000 people, and the architects, Messrs. Horn and Jameson, claim for it the most perfect acoustic qualities of any auditorium in the Republic except possibly the amphitheater of the Capitol. In tests made yesterday, a whisper on the platform could be heard with perfect distinctness in the third gallery. The grand harmonium has been furnished with another chime of bells, the first set having been rejected by Professor Hallam on account of defectiveness of tone. The Winter King, Churchill's last masterpiece, will be rendered for the first time tonight. Professor Hallam has pronounced it one of the greatest triumphs of the musical art. As the demand for seats will be large, admission will be had by drawings commencing promptly at 12:30 p.m. No change of program as given. Senator Cromwell, of the province of Urbana, had an attack of paralysis this morning at 6 o'clock as he was plowing in his field and has not yet recovered consciousness. This is his second attack, and the physicians fear it may prove fatal. Senator Cromwell is in the 4th year of his office as representative of the great province of Urbana, and by his modest dignity and usefulness, has made himself one of the most popular senators that ever filled the office. He was the inventor of the Cromwell harrow and was the first to adopt the practice of dehorning cattle. Exchange reports show that 27 million DMs were cancelled yesterday. This large volume of business was caused by the approaching cooler weather, which called out a heavy tonnage of coal. Potatoes in bond are not doing well, and the Bureau of Subsistence has ordered them cut 20% to encourage consumption and prevent loss. The sensation of the day is the arrival at the port of Corinthus of another vessel from America. It was brought up this morning about 8 o'clock and is a typical American ship of 250 tons. Captain Brent, master, with a crew of 8. The vessel is owned by J. Edward Barrington of the United States and sailed through the barriers about 7 months ago. Mr. Barrington is at present in conference with the Director of Navigation, and it is not known what his plans for the future are. A great crowd has already collected on the pier, and Professor Morris, the well-known American author and president of the Naval College, will arrive from the capital on the 12 o'clock express to meet his countrymen. Special resume at 12 o'clock. The voice ceased, and touching the button again, the director turned to me. I have not given all, or anything like half what came to us as current news, but just simply a sample. I inquired if this news was being read from a daily paper through the telephone, and the director replied that it was the paper, or what corresponded to it, itself. Do you mean to say, I asked with astonishment, that all of the people get the news as we have just heard it? I mean to say, answered the director, that several millions of people heard or had the opportunity of hearing the same voice, giving out the same news that we have just listened to. And there is no paper printed? I asked, scarcely able to grasp the idea of such a news service. None, except what is printed right there, pointing to a small machine I had noticed ticking on the table. Every word you have heard is reproduced there in print and can be preserved for future reading or destroyed at the option of the patron. I stepped to the table and looked, but could make nothing of the cabalistic signs on the paper before me. How is it, I inquired, that you speak the English language and do not use the Roman characters as other English-speaking people do? We used the same letters, answered the director, until the discovery of sound characters. Most of our books are printed in the old way, only the newest literature being printed with the sound characters. What do you call a sound character? I asked. I may not be able to make you understand, said the director, if you are unfamiliar with the development and progress of the knowledge of sound. I told him that the nature of sound as atmospheric vibrations was well understood by us, and mentioned the telephone and phonograph in common use as an illustration. Very well then, said he, it is simple enough. The vibrations are communicated to the machine, and the machine transmutes them into characters. Reproduce a sound 1,000,000 times and it will make the same character every time. It is a true phonetic system and is nature's own writing. Amazed at a civilization evidently so far in advance of ours. I had forgotten the circumstances by which I was surrounded and would have questioned further, but the genial official excused himself, saying that his duties would deprive him of the further pleasure of my company at that time, but that he hoped to meet me again soon, outside of business hours and in a social way. In the meantime, I would receive the attention of the government. Pressing another button, he informed me that a carriage was ready to return me to my vessel, where in a few hours I would probably be called upon by my distinguished countrymen and other representatives of the government. Grasping his extended hand heartily, I thanked him for his kindness and returned to the wharf. As I approached, in the conduct of the same officer who had carried me from the boat, the curious crowd fell back respectfully and I passed on board. Notwithstanding our position was one calculated to repress every emotion except astonishment, I found Captain Brent in a tremendous state of wrath, and the steward was describing the heathenish country to which we had drifted, in a flight of profanity that was positively eloquent. On learning the cause, I found that the last named dignitary had been out in the city trying to purchase fresh meats and vegetables, of which the men stood in great need after their long voyage. It seemed, though, that neither gold or silver would be accepted in payment, and so the dinner of fresh victuals that all had looked forward to so eagerly, was not in sight. We were soon relieved, however, by the appearance of a van load of fresh supplies, which the vendor said was brought on an order from the Marine Office. I retired to my cabin and tried to collect my thoughts. I had been but a few hours in this wonderful country, and already my senses had taken in more, it seemed to me, than my mind could analyze and digest in weeks. I felt as if I would like to get away by myself for 2 or 3 days and think it over. Everything was so new and strange, that all mental effort was directed to grasping the situation. To be continued. Chapter 3 continued. After a dinner of fresh meats and vegetables, the first we had tasted since we left America, I was called on by Professor Morris, a fine-looking gentleman, apparently about 65 years old, who came aboard with the burgomaster of the city and several other persons of position, and welcomed us all to the Iron Republic. Our countryman seemed delighted to see us, and he was to me the one link that connected us with a former world and imparted reality to scenes and circumstances that would otherwise have seemed an illusion. After an hour's conversation in which the voyage was discussed, and in which I learned that he had come through the barriers by the same channel that we had, he left us saying that he would call in the evening and take Captain Brent and myself to the opening of the new temple, where we would have the opportunity to see the President and meet him afterwards. Professor Morris was of the same opinion as myself in regard to the permanency of the strait which brought us through the barriers, but he thought it probable that it might be gorged with ice and remain closed for years at the time. Indeed, he thought that it was perhaps only open at rare intervals when the seas were unusually clear of ice. However that may be, I found the strait open both going and coming, and except for the current experienced no difficulty whatever in getting through, and it is my opinion, based on a theory which I have formed and which will be fully explained in my forthcoming book, that there is yet another passage through these barriers which may be found if it is sought for with half the ardor that has been devoted to Arctic explorations. We accompanied Professor Morris to witness the opening of the new temple that evening, and as we took our places in the tier of seats set apart for visitors and strangers, I never gazed upon a finer interior or saw a more superior audience. From pit to gallery was such an array of female toilets as was never dreamed of in America. Indeed, it seemed to me, as my eyes swept over the magnificent auditorium, some grand pageant prepared in honor of a royal Mardi Gras or fete. The costumes of the ladies were similar in style and richness to those of the most superb ballet, and every gentleman was in full dress with knee breeches, ruffles and buttoner. What seemed remarkable to me was that the people in the last gallery were just as handsomely dressed as any in the house. I called Professor Morris' attention to this, and he informed me that there were no social differences in any part of the house, that the seats were all drawn by lot, and the most distinguished person in the city might draw a seat in the gallery, while a hod carrier got the best in the house. As a matter of fact, he said it would be difficult to make social distinctions, as the President of the Republic was a brick mason. Just then the orchestra, or rather the great harmonium, began to play, and the laughter and conversation of the brilliant assemblage drowned in a crash of music, grander than anything I had ever heard before. From a tremendous explosion of harmony, it would sink to the softest tones of flute and harp, and then again swell to a crash of melodious sounds in which were chimes of deep-toned bells, roar of drums, shrieking of horns and concussion of anvils, dying away again to the delicate tremulous quaver of a single violin string. And as these divine strains from the instrument rose and fell in the production of the musical drama, the theme was illustrated by wonderful spectacular view projected on the curtain of the stage. I noticed from the program that this production was the Winter King, and as the fierce north wind howled and shrieked and moaned in the musical passages, the snow fell in the spectacular and the sleet-laden trees crashed before the blast. Anon, breakers boomed and thundered on a rock-bound shore, and then could be seen a dismantled ship drifting to wreck and ruin. Altogether, it was the grandest thing I ever saw, or, it seemed to me, that human genius could produce. Another fine effect I noticed